My book is a graphic novel. It's a 3 parts, basically it's a trilogy. First and second books are now out, and I'm currently working on the 3rd book. Trilogy is called Abhi's Underdogs. The first book was called Legend of the Phoenix Dragon, and the second book, which just released, is Hero's Beginning. Yeah, basically the whole series is based on Broome. Born and raised in Broome, and growing up I heard a lot of stories, a lot of ghost stories, a lot of funny stories about growing up, not just by myself, but especially my nan's generation. My grandmother was an incredibly hard woman. Actually, the main character of the book, Abhi, is named after my nan. And growing up, I always just heard stories about my grandmother and her sort of generation. Tend to be a lot more different than any other sort of generation of stories I've heard. A lot of interesting things happening. So, and it tends to be a lot of the best ghost stories I was told seem to come from my nan's generation. So, basically created a fictional story, even though the main character's inspired by my nan. She's not factually based on her, but yeah, basically Abhi and her gang called the Underdogs, just a bunch of kids in the 1940s, just after World War II, and yeah, just by the exploits and adventures that they get up to in and around Broome. Yeah, it goes among many things. Broome's a very multicultural sort of town, like mainly because of the pearling. There's a big pearling industry there in Broome. Most of the pearls in Australia come from Broome. And because of that, we had not just Aboriginal people and Europeans, but Malaysian, Chinese, Japanese, Irish. Myself, my heritage is my grandfather was from Malaysia, and it's not. If you go to Broome now, you see that there's a lot of Aboriginal kids there who aren't like full-blood Aboriginals. They're sort of half Aboriginal, half Japanese, or half Aboriginal, half Italian, and there's a lot of mix. So basically, around about my nan's era, there were a lot of people from all around the world that came to Broome, and they kind of brought their sort of ghost stories and their folklores and their little urban myths and their sort of bedtime stories, I guess, with them. And just over the last 50 years, Broome sort of have an impact to the point where some of the stories have kind of been tailor-made just for like the Broome community. And it was funny because I always thought they were traditional stories, like traditional Broome stories or traditional Aboriginal stories, but as I did some research, I found out like no, like a lot of the stories I've been told actually came from Asia or came from Europe or Africa, and no, it's been really interesting. So that's why I'm really intrigued about my nan's sort of generation. So yeah, we still have the antagonist and protagonist for sure. Abhi is basically the protagonist in the story. She's not a very typical typical hero, I guess. First of all, she's a girl. She's a girl of who's the leader of a gang. There were a lot of gangs growing up in Broome. It was almost like every sort of nationality had their own sort of gang of young boys, about between 10, 20, 30 of them that sort of just looked after their community. Same thing in Abhi's Underdogs. All the nationalities, sort of, all the communes have their group of tough boys to look after them, and Abhi's the Underdogs is actually made up of like a gang of sort of kids that couldn't make it in their own sort of home neighbourhood, I guess. Abhi's Aboriginal, but we have Sel, who's Malaysian, Finn, who's Irish, and Gabe, who's from New Zealand. And they're sort of the members that the other gangs didn't want, so they've made up their own little gang. And so in the typical setting, they're almost like a group of rejects, of underdogs that don't come across as the heroes of the story. They do eventually become that, but this is going right back to the start, where they're just considered nobodies. So and if you look at the bad guy, the villain of the story, is actually a family called the Don Appletons, who dominate everything. So they're slowly kind of taken over the entire pearling industry. So and pearling, even still today, pearling families are, they're sort of the wealth, the crown jewels sort of thing. So poor Don Appleton, who owns the industry, has a son by the name of Scotty Don Appleton, and yeah, he's sort of he's the one that gets under everyone's skin. So we have a villain who's got money, wealth, everything, a lot of power, and we've got the hero who's virtually got nothing. And but her grit basically is what sort of gets her through. So yeah, I guess I aimed at more so at primary. I started getting into comics myself when I was about 10. When I was 12, I was like a real hardcore comic fanatic. So I've always kind of aimed a lot of my stuff at that age because I always feel like that's the age when you really. I mean, I could be wrong. No, I know I'm wrong. Sorry, but for me, I always felt like, and for other kids I've met, that's always been sort of that 10 to 12 is when you fall madly in love with comics. You know, I'm pretty sure you can fall in love with comics at any time, but that was sort of the age group I was looking at. But I've been quite happy. I mean, a lot of older readers too, a lot of comic book collectors, you know, from 25 to 45 have been getting into hobbies, and even on Facebook, they're usually the ones sending me most of the requests about where I'm going, what I'm doing, what I've got planned for the next book. So no, it's been across the board, but yeah, the focus group originally was between 10 and 12. So I hope it's really hard to say because in Australia we virtually don't have an industry. You can kind of tell that the comic books, with Marvel for instance, a lot of their language in a lot of way that told is underlying. You can see that the American culture somehow influenced that, and the comics need to reflect that in some way. Same with the Japanese, like the manga humor is just Japanese humor, you know, and it's great stuff as well. And I think the tricky thing with Australia is that we really don't have an industry. We kind of get most of our comics from overseas, definitely from America and definitely from Japan, and then maybe Europe and a few other places. But Australian comic books have always been. It's just too hard to compete against the rest of the world. So we've just consumed a lot of comics, but we haven't really created a lot of comics. Except as of recently, however, with myself and a few other good creators have made some waves. So it's been good. So as far as like what's the traditional sense of me telling a story, I guess I'm finding that out for myself too. Yeah. So there hasn't been a lot of questions I went to go and ask people. Everyone kind of said the same thing: is we don't know because it's not really an industry. There's not really a lot of people doing what you're doing. So myself and again these creators are sort of kind of, it feels like we're stumbling in the dark, but that trial and error. We're all learning the best way to tell a story, and we're all very different. But it's still all kind of a learning curve, I guess.
Is there something you'd like to add?
No, I'm honoured to be invited to this festival. It's really cool. This first international trip I've done. So literature festival that I've done. I think the first time I went overseas was last year. It's been really cool. So coming here and meeting like-minded people, not just in Australia. I think who else knows about graphic novels outside of the country? But of course, since I've this morning just meeting other authors and all of them saying roughly the same thing, that they were all kids at some point and they all love cartoons and comic books as well. So no, it's an honour to be here with such a prestigious list of authors. So no, it's going to be cool.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
You're welcome. All right, thank you.